When a neighbor calls the police over a noise complaint, most people panic, and that panic leads to mistakes. As a lawyer, I'll show you exactly what to say, what not to say, and how to stay firmly in control, because one wrong sentence can escalate everything. Here's how to protect yourself calmly and confidently. What to say to the police. The moment someone calls the police on you for a noise complaint, the stakes shift instantly, even if you didn't intend any trouble. And if you don't know the right words, tone, and boundaries, a simple noise call can turn into a citation, a landlord report, or in the worst cases, an escalation you never saw coming. So I want to begin by telling you the truth most people don't realize. The police don't respond to noise complaints because of how loud something is. They respond because a neighbor has reported a disturbance, and now their job is to assess your behavior, your cooperation, and your potential risk. They're not measuring sound, they're measuring you. In the first 15 seconds after you open that door, your nervous system is working against you. When you hear that knock and see police through your peephole, your amygdala fires off a stress response. Your heart rate increases. Your prefrontal cortex, which handles reasoning and impulse control, goes slightly offline. This is why people say the wrong thing. They argue, they panic, they get defensive, and the officer interprets that as resistance or hostility. So the first thing we have to do is override your biology before you say a single word. A slow breath, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out, immediately lowers cortisol levels. That alone keeps you in control of your facial expression and your tone, and both matter more than the actual words you use. Officers rely heavily on two cues: emotional intensity and cooperative posture. They're trained to classify you as compliant or confrontational within seconds. If they sense irritation, sarcasm, or evasiveness, the situation escalates automatically because their body enters its own stress loop. Their sympathetic nervous system activates. Their risk assessment becomes conservative. That's how a simple conversation turns into an investigation. So when the knock happens, your first objective is control of your voice, body, and environment. If music is on, turn it completely off before you approach the door. Not down, off. Leaving it on keeps you inside a violation. Turning it off removes the problem entirely and strips officers of the justification to push further. Then, when you open the door, you never open it fully. A 6-inch crack with a chain or latch is ideal because it preserves your Fourth Amendment protection. When you open the door wide, officers interpret that as implied consent to enter. If anything inside your home is in plain view, alcohol, a guest acting foolish, even clutter, it can be documented as potential evidence. Not because they're out to get you, but because plain view doctrine requires them to acknowledge what they see. So control the environment by controlling the gap in the door. Your hands must be visible, preferably at mid-torso height, palms neutral. Humans read palms instinctively. Open palms signal non-threat. Officers' training reinforces this. If your hands aren't visible, their pupils dilate and they shift weight to their dominant leg. You do not want that physiological response. Keep your hands relaxed and visible. Now let's talk about the first words out of your mouth, because this is where people lose control. Your goal is not to argue. Your goal is not to defend yourself. Your goal is to end the officer's reason for being there. And you do that with a 3-part phrase that hits the human brain exactly where compliance is evaluated. It must acknowledge the complaint, apologize without admitting liability, and assure correction. When those 3 conditions are satisfied, the officer's internal justification for further investigation is gone. So I want you to speak slowly, not because you're scared, but because controlled tempo signals emotional stability. Something like, "Good evening, officer. I'm turning the music off now. I apologize if it got too loud. It'll stay quiet for the rest of the night." This sentence is doing several things. First, you're identifying yourself as a rational, cooperative adult. Second, you're removing the disturbance. Third, you're showing awareness and social responsibility. Fourth, you are not admitting guilt. An apology for inconvenience is not a legal admission. And lastly, you're closing the loop. You're saying the problem is resolved. The officer's brain reads this as no threat, no hostility, no ongoing issue. Officers are evaluated on their ability to de-escalate. When you make it easy, they accept the exit. Now, here's where people panic. The officer asks, "Do you mind if we come in and check?" You must understand that this question is not a command. It is a request. Officers prefer consent over warrants because consent requires no paperwork, no judicial oversight, and no probable cause. But you lose your greatest legal protection the moment you say yes. Your response must be polite, calm, and absolute. You cannot show aggression, and you cannot show uncertainty. You simply say, "I appreciate it, officer, but I don't consent to any entry. The noise is off and everything is handled." Why does this work? Because officers cannot treat a noise complaint as a criminal investigation unless they observe additional evidence of wrongdoing. By removing the noise, you collapse the foundation for their request. And by stating lack of consent calmly, not defensively, you deny entry without triggering confrontation. You're invoking your Fourth Amendment rights in a way that doesn't activate their defensive posture. If an officer pressures further, you still stick to the same line, but with slightly more structure. Of course, officer, if you have a warrant signed by a judge, I'll cooperate fully, but I don't consent to entry. This is not hostility. This is clarity. You are drawing a boundary, and officers are legally trained to respect verbal boundaries when stated calmly. Now let's address ID, because this confuses people. For a noise complaint, you are not required to present ID unless your state has a stop and identify statute and the officer is issuing a citation. If they are not writing a ticket, ID is optional. So if they ask for ID casually without saying you're being cited, you can respond with, "Am I being detained, officer? If not, I'd prefer to continue from here." That question, "Am I being detained?" activates a legal threshold. Officers cannot claim you're detained unless they have reasonable suspicion of a crime, and noise complaints are civil matters. You are not accusing them of overreach, you are clarifying the legal status of the interaction, and if they say you are not detained, you are free to decline ID without escalation. Now let's talk physiologically about tone. The human ear reads emotional tension in the upper frequencies of speech. When someone is afraid, their voice becomes thinner. When they are defensive, it becomes sharper. Officers are trained to hear these vocal shifts and interpret them as stress or deception. So when you speak, round your tone. Slightly slower, slightly lower. Controlled breathing helps with this. Your voice should sound like someone solving a problem, not resisting an authority figure. Another important detail, do not use absolute statements like, "I wasn't loud," "My neighbors hate me," or "This is ridiculous." These statements shift the conversation from resolution to debate, and when the officer senses debate, their attention shifts from the noise to your behavior. You do not want the focus on your behavior, you want it on the problem being over. This brings us back to the psychology of compliance. Officers respond to 3 cues more strongly than anything else: acknowledgement, apology, and assurance. Not because they're looking for domination, but because these signals tell them the risk is gone. The encounter can end safely, the paperwork can be avoided, their job is completed, and in their training simulations, the cooperative citizen is the safest citizen. The biggest mistake people make is trying to justify why the noise happened. They explain, they defend, they argue. This activates the officer's evaluative brain instead of their exit brain. You must never justify. You must simply resolve. I want to walk you through the 3 most dangerous sentences people say that instantly shift an encounter from civil to adversarial. It wasn't even that loud. They always do this. "I know my rights." Every single one of these sentences spikes the officer's perception of resistance. When resistance goes up, enforcement goes up. So we do not use these sentences. Instead, you use controlled responsibility, not admitting wrongdoing, but acknowledging the situation. This is more powerful than people realize because it neutralizes tension without compromising your legal position. Scenario-specific ideas for parties, apartments, hostile neighbors, and confrontational officers. What most people don't understand is that once the police are at your door for a noise complaint, they're no longer evaluating the noise, they're evaluating your behavior. Because your behavior determines whether this interaction stays civil, becomes investigative, or escalates into enforcement. And the moment you open the door, you begin a negotiation without realizing it. Not a negotiation in the legal sense, but a negotiation of social cues, authority, compliance, and cooperation. This is why you must approach the interaction as a controlled performance, not an argument. In situations of heightened stress, your sympathetic nervous system wants to either defend or explain. That is counterproductive. Officers judge threat, not fairness. They judge stability, not accuracy. They judge compliance signals, not the facts of who's right or wrong in a neighbor dispute. So let's break the interaction into psychological phases, because understanding these phases gives you total control. The first phase is arrival and orientation. Officers approach your door with incomplete information. They don't know if you're intoxicated, angry, armed, or confused. They rely heavily on their training, which defaults to caution. Their cortisol levels increase slightly the moment they reach the door. Their hand may hover near their belt. They're in assessment mode. Your goal in this moment is to reduce their cognitive load. If you look calm, speak calmly, and show visible compliance, you lower their stress response immediately. When officers feel safe, they do less. When they feel uncertain, they do more. The second phase is dialogue framing. This begins the moment you first speak. Most people make the mistake of opening with defensiveness or confusion. What? Who called you? Or why are you here? These questions signal 2 things to an officer: resistance and emotional volatility. If they sense those, they shift into control mode, which means more questions, more scrutiny, and potentially more pressure. Instead, you open with acknowledgement. A simple, "Good evening, officer," instantly signals cooperation. Using their title triggers a respect response in the brain. They recognize you are not challenging authority. When you say, "I'm turning the music off now," Use signal agency. Agency reduces suspicion. You are showing you understand the problem and are solving it. The third phase is boundary testing. Officers will often test the boundary with a polite request to enter. This is not about checking noise levels. It's about assessing whether you understand your rights and whether you'll permit expanded access. Officers prefer consent because it streamlines the encounter. But your boundary must be clear, gentle, and firm. Noise is not exigency. Loud music is not a threat to life. Your neighbor being annoyed is not an emergency. Courts have repeatedly confirmed that noise does not justify forced entry. But here's the nuance. If you open the door wide, step back, or invite them in accidentally, that does create implied consent. Officers can then legally enter, and everything they see inside becomes fair game. This is why the position of your body matters. Stand in the doorway. Do not step back. Do not widen the door. Your body is a physical boundary that reinforces your verbal refusal. Officers are trained to respect a verbal refusal, paired with a maintained threshold. Now, let's address the next major trigger, over-explanation. When people are stressed, they explain excessively, but excessive explanation signals deception. Even if you're telling the truth, if you ramble, apologize repeatedly, or provide unnecessary details, officers interpret that as anxiety and potential concealment. So the rule is simple. One sentence per idea, one sentence to acknowledge, one sentence to apologize, one sentence to assure. That's all. Now let's walk through scenario-specific language because the words change depending on your situation. When you're alone at home, "Good evening, officer. I'm turning it off now. Sorry if it carried. It's quiet for the night." When you have a small group of friends inside, "Good evening, officer. We've turned everything off. Didn't realize it carried through the walls. It's done for the night." When you're having a larger gathering, "Officer, I appreciate you coming by. We've ended the music. People are wrapping up now. It's handled." When alcohol is involved, do not mention it unless asked directly. If asked, "I'm staying home for the night, officer. Music's off and we're winding everything down." This reassures them you're not about to become a driving risk. Now the next phase is information control. Officers will often ask questions casually, but you must differentiate between courtesy questions and investigative questions. Courtesy questions: how many people are inside? How long has the music been playing? What's the occasion? You are not required to answer these. Giving details adds stress and prolongs the interaction, so your response should be neutral and non-committal. "I'd prefer not to answer questions, officer, but everything is under control and we're keeping it quiet." There is nothing confrontational about that sentence. It's controlled. It's respectful. It preserves your Fifth Amendment rights. If they shift into investigative questions, "Has anyone been drinking? Are there any minors inside? Can we take a quick look?" This is where you rely on the boundary script. "I respect what you're doing, officer. I don't consent to any entry and I prefer not to answer questions without legal counsel." The issue is resolved. No emotion. No argument, just structure. Now let's discuss tone and facial expression because these matter more than people realize. Your face must be neutral, not irritated, not sarcastic, not amused. A neutral expression with slight softness in the eyebrows signals calm compliance. Your voice must remain controlled. When your voice gets thin or shaky, officers interpret it as fear or aggression. When your voice gets too loud, they interpret it as emotional escalation. Keep volume slightly lower than normal. Your gaze should be steady, not darting. Darting eyes signal distress or deception. A steady gaze signals control. Now the final phase is exit signaling. Once the officer acknowledges your response, you end the interaction. People make the mistake of lingering or adding commentary. Never do that. After your final assurance, "Everything is quiet for the night. Thank you for your time." Pause. Wait for their acknowledgement. Nod once. Close the door slowly, not abruptly, not timidly. This sends a clear signal the matter is closed. Once the officer leaves, you must complete the post-interaction protocol. Document time, officer name if visible, and brief notes of what was said. This protects you if your neighbor becomes retaliatory or if the landlord receives a distorted version of events. How to address hostile neighbors and repeat complainers. Hostile neighbors, repeat complainers, or people who weaponize police calls create an entirely different level of risk. When someone repeatedly calls the police for minor noise, it's almost never about the noise itself. It's about tension, resentment, personal dislike, or power. Understanding this dynamic protects you from falling into the trap most people walk into, retaliating or explaining. When a neighbor becomes adversarial, their nervous system becomes conditioned to interpret your behavior as disruptive, even when it's within normal limits. This means they're not measuring decibels. They're measuring emotion, but the law does not enforce emotion. It enforces conduct. So your job is to stay within the law and document everything. When you stay controlled, the law stays on your side. If the neighbor confronts you directly instead of calling the police, the worst thing you can do is escalate. Direct confrontation activates two nervous systems and spikes adrenaline on both sides. People start to talk faster, interrupt, and assert dominance. When that happens, neither party is thinking, they're reacting. And reacting leads to arguments that get written into police reports later as verbal hostile exchange. So when the neighbor approaches you with anger, irritation, or accusations, your strategy must be surgical. You do not match their energy. You do not explain. You do not defend. You use 3 controlled sentences. I hear you. I'll look into it. Thanks for letting me know. That's it. You're not agreeing with them. You're not admitting wrongdoing. You are closing the interaction. Anything more gives them ammunition. Anything less gives them provocation. If they continue to push, raising their voice, slinging insults, demanding explanations, you pivot to the disengagement line. I'm not going to argue about this. I'll handle it. Have a good evening. Then you walk away calmly, not quickly. Quick movement signals fear or guilt, calmly. Now, if the same neighbor repeatedly calls police on you, you need a system to protect yourself. Police respond differently when they see repeat calls from the same address. After the second or third complaint, they start evaluating whether the caller is the problem, not the resident. So you need to present yourself as the rational, stable party every single time. The more professional and controlled you appear, the more officers shift suspicion onto the caller. Documentation is key here. After each interaction, you write down the date, time, what was heard, what was said, and whether the officer confirmed anything. If the officer tells you, "We didn't hear anything from the hallway," that's gold. Write it down. If it happens twice, you can escalate through non-police channels. The appropriate escalation is not retaliation. It's administrative. In an apartment building, you email the landlord or property manager with a neutral, fact-based message. Hi, I've had multiple police visits from noise complaints. Each time the officers confirmed no excessive noise. I want to avoid any tension with my neighbor, so I'm documenting this for clarity. Managers read this type of message as responsible tenant. Problem is coming from someone else. If the neighbor keeps calling 911 for non-emergencies, you document and submit a misuse of emergency services report through your city's non-emergency portal. Most cities have a form for repeat, unfounded calls. Some jurisdictions issue fines. This shifts pressure away from you. Now let's talk about apartment acoustics, because this matters more than most people think. In multi-unit buildings with older construction, sound travels vertically and diagonally, not just horizontally. People often hear noise from a floor above or below, assume the source is next door, and complain to the wrong neighbor. Police see this constantly, so if you know your walls are thin, you use prevention phrases that demonstrate goodwill and avoid escalation entirely. A simple text through your building's community group chat or hallway bulletin board message like, "Guys, I'll be watching a movie tonight around 8 to 10 p.m. Let me know if it's ever too loud. I'll adjust." This one line does 2 things. It shows preemptive courtesy. It creates a social contract that prevents surprise calls. Now let's talk about one of the most dangerous situations in noise complaint interactions: intoxication. Alcohol impairs your ability to filter and regulate speech. If you've been drinking, you're more likely to speak defensively or aggressively. Officers know this. They're trained to listen for slurred speech, irregular cadence, delayed reaction time, and exaggerated politeness. When they detect intoxication, they become more cautious because they've dealt with too many situations where intoxicated residents suddenly escalate. So if you've been drinking and you know it, your goal is simplicity: short sentences, slow breathing, neutral expression. If you can't trust yourself to speak clearly, step outside and close the door behind you before talking. This prevents officers from observing anyone inside who might be more intoxicated or out of control. Your script becomes even more controlled. "Evening, officer. The music's off. We're done for the night. Appreciate you stopping by." Officers interpret this as stability. You're signaling that you are not a risk, despite alcohol being present. Now let's explore a critical point that almost no one understands. The police officer's report matters more than your version of events. Whether or not you get cited, officers still write notes. These notes can be viewed by landlords, HOAs, or future responding officers. If your report reads hostile, argumentative, or uncooperative, your future interactions get harder. If it reads polite, apologized, and compliant, future interactions get easier. Every time an officer leaves your door, you are building your reputation in their system. That reputation determines the tone of every future visit. Think of each interaction as your record, not a criminal record, but a behavioral record. You want a reputation of calmness. When officers know you, trust you, and see you as the reasonable resident, encounters become trivial. Now let's address the issue of police pressure. Sometimes officers push harder. Sometimes an officer insists, "I really need to check inside." Sometimes Sometimes they use subtle pressure. It'll be quick, or we just want to make sure everything's okay. Your brain interprets this as a command because of the uniform, but legally these are requests, and your rights do not bend because an officer uses a more assertive tone. Your response remains the same. I respect you, officer. I don't consent to any entry. Everything is quiet now. This line is a shield. It protects you even if you are nervous, and if the officer insists again, you stay consistent. I understand. If you have a warrant, I'll cooperate fully. Until then, I don't consent. Consistency signals strength, not aggression. Strength. Officers respect that. They don't respect people who panic, change their tone, or get hostile. They respect people who speak clearly, steadily, and politely. Let's talk about escalation through guests. This is incredibly common. You may be calm, but someone inside may be intoxicated, loud, or confrontational. Officers read them as part of your environment, and if the environment looks chaotic, officers escalate. So before you go to the door, you must manage your internal environment first. You tell everyone inside, quiet, turn everything off, let me handle it. You must isolate yourself as the spokesperson. Officers respond better to one controlled individual than a room full of noise and movement. If a guest tries to intervene, your language must be sharp and controlled. Stop, I'm handling this. Officers perceive this as leadership. Leadership lowers their adrenaline. Like this video? Click on the cards showing on your screen for more.